and a warm welcome to everyone. I, Geeta Malhotra, Ehsaas woman of Kanpur, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to yet another session that strives to bring together authors and their readers in an informal and engaging setting. The Right Circle, a stellar literary initiative by Prabha Khaitan Foundation. The Right Circle is a unique platform that brings together literary enthusiasts, aspiring writers, and seasoned authors. It is a space where ideas flourish, conversations spark inspiration, and stories come to life. We are elated to have amongst us a novelist, academician, and a commentator on the arts, literature, and higher education, Saikat Majumdar. Today's event is in association with our venue and hospitality partner, the Landmark Towers, our Hindi print media partner, Dainik Jagran, and the support of the Ehsaas Women of Kanpur. The session is supported by our esteemed patron, Sri Cement Limited, as their CSR initiative. Before we proceed to the conversation, please allow me to talk a little about the foundation. Prabha Khaitan Foundation, a non-profitable trust based in Kolkata, was founded by eminent literature and cultural activist late Dr. Prabha Khaitan in the early 1980s. Her vision of working for a better tomorrow is woven in her famous words, Karam hi Jeevan hai, work is life. The Prabha Khaitan Foundation endeavors to showcase the literary and cultural assets of India. It curates the best of events to widen the spectrum of languages and literature, be it English, Hindi, or regional languages. Authors and artists connect with their niche audience through events under the auspice of its varied initiatives. Music to us is an important part of culture. Our anthem, Unity in Diversity, deserves special mention in this regard. We are also happy to share that three-time Grammy Award winner Ricky Cage, who is the man behind the signature caller tune of Prabha Khaitan Foundation, has curated a number of amazing musical pieces to score across the video invites of Prabha Khaitan Foundation's events as well as social media platforms. This August, the music of the month is Celebration of Diversity with Hip Hop. Hip hop music is said to have originated in the West, but every nation has its own equivalent. This piece celebrates freedom, diversity, and honesty. Now, without further ado, allow me to introduce our guest author for the evening, Saikat Majumdar. Saikat Majumdar is a novelist, academic, and a commentator on the arts, literature, and higher education. He is the author of the following novels: Silverfish, The Firebird, Playhouse, The Scent of God, acclaimed as one of the major queer novels to come out of India following the decriminalization of homosexuality. The Middle Finger, a contemporary college campus novel that seeks to retell ancient myths, and most recently, The Remains of the Body. Saikat has taught world literature at Stanford University, was a fellow at the Humanities Center at Wellesley College, Massachusetts. In spring 2023, he was a fellow at the Stellenbosch Institute of Advanced Study, South Africa. He is currently a professor of English and creative writing at Ashoka University. He writes regularly for The Telegraph, Times Higher Education, Outlook, Hindu, Hindustan Times, Scroll, and a book column for the Los Angeles Review of Books, Another Look at India's Books. For what seems to be a promising one, today's conversation with the author will be moderated by Ms. Aarti Gupta. She's an Ehsaas woman of Kanpur. Without further ado, over to you, Aarti. Thank you.
Thank you, Geeta Aunty. A very, very good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to yet another Right Circle of Prabha Khaitan Foundation. Saikat, it's an immense pleasure to have you here in Kanpur. I must admit, I'm usually used to public speaking, but I'm hearing all your accomplishments. I'm slightly nervous to have this conversation today, you know. You've emerged as one of the most powerful and significant voices of your generation in Indian literature. And through your beautifully crafted narratives, you've delved into the intricacies of human relationship with various socio-political contexts. Your works not only examines but also gently interrogates, accepted societal norms, traditions, and behaviors. The extensive body of work, which Geeta Auntie, some of which she mentioned, and she only mentioned the novels, but there are critical essays and another whole lot of academic contributions, such respect and admiration that it's both exhilarating and humbling to actually be in this conversation with you. Thank you, thank you. Can we have a loud applause for Saikat for being here in Kanpur? So let us start at the very beginning, Tell us a little bit about your formative years. How did you get into writing, How did this come about?
Right. Thank you all for being here. It's a real delight. I know evenings are precious times, so I'm grateful that you made time for this. And I want to thank the Prabha Khaitan Foundation for inviting me. I've been involved with them as a jury of their awards, but this is my first event with you all. And thank you especially, Aarti, for having this conversation. So it's wonderful. I'm glad you asked this question. Childhood is very important. My own childhood, and I think childhood keeps coming back in my fiction. My childhood is important, but in a very complicated way. And when I look back, I think the thing that stands out the most is the fact that my mother, who passed away young, in her 50s, she was an actress. She was primarily an actress on stage, on theatre. So I have this very interesting relationship with theatre, though I am in literature. Sort of, I think anybody who's grown up in Calcutta has, or anybody in any Indian city, theatre is such a big part. But for me, I have these memories of watching plays from the wings, from the darkness, walking into the green room and seeing my mother with half a wig and that. And I have this very interesting visceral memory of theatre. And it was kind of a moment of pride, but it's very complicated when you're a performing artist from a educated middle class family. I think actresses are seen, certainly I'm talking about the 1980s, there's a lot of stigma also attached to it. There's a lot of suspicion. And it's a little hard for me to talk about it, but this led to a lot of difficulty in my family. This led to a lot of controversy and all of that. And eventually my parents separated. I was 12 when they separated, and there was a lot of sort of anger and all of that about it. And for me, it was very strange. But when I was a really small child, I wanted to be an actor. So it's like, clearly, that didn't work out. Obviously, I'm doing something else. But I think, and that partly had to do with obviously watching my mother, and seeing her name on billboards. But she was primarily in theatre, but she did some films.
There's still time.
There's always time, I guess. But and films, and she did a lot of television. So I had that whole sense of, this is very interesting. But at the same time, I quickly realized that acting is not necessarily very respectable. From a middle class educated point of view, it's not respectable, and it's very complicated. I don't want to go into that whole detail, that how an actress is also associated with a certain kind of public woman, and very quickly what happened was this whole desire to act sort of vanished. And my mother used to say that, don't act, study, that is not all that. You should be, you're good in studies, just go and study. And slowly I realized I moved away from performance, and I became very uncomfortable. I gained some confidence back. I'm talking now through teaching. Later on, that's a different process. For the longest time, I was very shy. I was very traumatized, partly because of the problems at home, partly because of what it meant to put your body out there as an actor. And I turned to literature. I think my refuge, because of the difficulties of my family, I turned to books, and books offered me a kind of a silence. So I have this kind of love-hate relationship with performance. I really truly admire people who can act, who can sing, but I knew I moved away from that into the quietness of the literature, and especially the novel, which is in some ways, you read a story, you kind of act, you can't hide it, but you're hiding a book under your studies. Nobody knows what you're doing it. You kind of, that sort of a thing. And that, I think, moved away. And I also, there was a time when I could have written in Bangla or in English, but I chose English, partly because I wanted to be insulated from that whole traumatic surrounding, that immediacy, and I wanted to move away. And eventually I went abroad and all of that. So I think in many ways, I have these very strange memories. I mean, for the longest time, I had this memory of, I think I was 5 years old. Obviously, nobody has a memory from the age of 5, but this is something you talk. And I had this memory of watching my mother act in a play where she was dying. And it was quite terrifying, actually, that, because I didn't know that whether she was dying or, I didn't know it was a play. It was very terrifying. So later on, when I was teaching at Stanford, I told one of my colleagues, who was a performance theorist, that, I have this really haunting memory from my childhood, mother dying. And she said, I think you have a novel there. So that actually led to my novel, The Firebird, which is, I think initially it's a little personal, and then of course it's fiction, but it's actually a story of a young boy's relationship with his mother's life as a theater actress. How he processes that, how the pride slowly turns into a kind of a shame, how the art form of theater becomes destructive, because theater can be a very powerful but very destructive art form. And so I think in many ways I retain that sense of and I think my artistic sense comes from my mother, that sense of art, that love. She was also a lover of literature, all of that. But in many ways, I think there's a lot of trauma associated with it. I think a lot of my novels, sort of families are broken, unhappy, that is very much there. But that also led me towards books. I think I was a very shy child. I went to a boarding school. I was really shy. And then suddenly in grade 7 or grade 8, I discovered books, I discovered literature. And I started debating, I started doing poetry, and suddenly I became confident. And that completely changed things for me. So I think in many ways that turning away, that whole sense, when I wrote The Firebird, I felt that I must capture in novel. The novel is a modern, secular, rational form, but there's something older, something savage and powerful about theater. How does one capture in this modern form of the novel this performative energy of theater? And so that tension, I think, really drove me to write this novel. So I think, of course, there are a lot of other things, but I think this was one of the overarching forces that put me, and I still remember how that happened and how that strange mixture of trauma, sorrow, and beauty which drove me to literature.
Oh, that's amazing, Saikat, and thank you for sharing those intimate moments from your childhood. We really appreciate it, and it's great how books became your solace, and now you're writing them, and they're hopefully someone else's solace who's trying to sort of deal with such situations. Reflecting on your educational journey, tell us a little bit about your time and when you went to the US and you studied there and you even taught at Stanford. Tell us a little bit about there. You did give us a sneak peek about how the Firebird came into existence, but tell us a little bit about your teaching career and then transitioning into writing.
Sure. No, obviously, I think I'm very interested. A lot of my novels are called coming-of-age novels, the Bildungsroman. So I'm very interested in how people become who they are, and obviously, this is you're asking about how I became the person I am. So that's a fascinating question. I don't think we ever know how we become the people we are, but we still keep asking.
I have a very interesting thing over there. Like Steve Jobs said that you cannot connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So today you're in that position where you can sort of connect the dots.
Yes.
So tell us, how do the dots connect?
It would be scary if you could connect the dots forward, because then it would be kind of boring. But no, I think I went to the US to do a MFA, a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing, and that was interesting because I think my training is primarily in Western literature. Though I read a lot in Bangla, but my primary training is in English, and I was pursuing a certain form of artistic excellence, which was very Western, the kind of form of the novel. My early influences were very, very much into European modernism, Joyce, Proust. So it was wonderful when I did that. I think the American MFA is a complicated experience. It's very technical, but America is also very insular when it comes to literary. They're not interested. So I was kind of a mixed experience. But what happened was, I think the real interesting thing happened when I started reading Indian literature in translation. Not Bangla, which I read in the original, but say when I read Manto or Anantamurti in translation, my initial response was, oh, this is kind of bad writing. This is not good writing. And then I realized that I have defining sense of good writing in a very narrow way, which is a very post-enlightenment, post-romantic, new critical sense of good writing, the perfect sentence. And that really led to an expansion of what is good writing. That there are ways in which you can sort of, writing can be eruptive. Writing doesn't have to subscribe to just a singular model. And that was a process of education. Again, when I wrote The Firebird, I think in many ways I was trying to inhabit an indigenous literary mode. So for me, that going back and forth between a Western model and an Indian model, and eventually it became very global because my scholarly work is about the British Empire. How English becomes a language of world literature. So I spent 6 months in South Africa last year. So I follow a lot of African literature. How English becomes a language of literature in Africa. How it becomes a language of literature in Ireland, in New Zealand, in South Asia and Caribbean. So this is something that really interests me. So I think I follow a lot of literature I teach a lot in this field. So I think in many ways it makes me a much more international person, but at the same time, I think what I love is how one's sense of craft is perpetually challenged. And this happens in films, that happens in music. I mean, I love jazz music partly because jazz music is so dissonant. Things don't add up. There's something, almost kind of something rough about it. So if you're used to very melodious music, jazz sounds harsh in your ears. And I think an artist should always be open to conflicting forms of art, which doesn't add up and is harmonious, which creates dissonance. So I think my life of living in different cultures, dealing with different kinds of artistic education has taught me dissonance. And I try to be open to that because, even when you're listening to street language, for any writer in India writing in English, this is a challenge. How do you capture a life that is not lived in English? This was Raja Rao's question in the 30s. How do you do it? How do you capture that? And often the answer is, I discuss this with my students all the time, that the answer is to write sentences that are a little awkward, faintly awkward. Not awkward enough to hinder communication, but awkward enough to let the reader know that this is not happening in English. There is another life behind. There's a shadow of a different language. And that awkwardness will create a certain unease in the reader. I'm a huge fan of unease. I love it when I make my students uneasy because things which make you uneasy actually stay with you. And I think that a single sentence can have the touch of unease, a language where the syntax is a little off, So I think these are my great discoveries as I move through, different cultures, different languages, and I think in many ways it challenges this linear trajectory of education, go and excel, which I think is something we hear all the time. But education is also about faltering, about failing, about rediscovering oneself, about learning, about unlearning. Writing is so much about unlearning things. So I think, that's a very scattered answer, I know, but I'm just trying to...
No, absolutely. And some great thoughts out there, right? I mean, that sentence, how do you capture a life which is not in English, which is not lived in English? That's a great statement and great insights about unlearning, right? I don't think we are there in our education system yet in India, right? But we're trying there. Like, I myself have a young teen who's sort of exploring different streams, from like sciences and trying to mix between sciences and literature and stuff like that. And we discussed that offline just now. But Saikat, tell us a little bit about your first novel, Silverfish, which introduced the readers to a unique narrative intertwining the lives of a retired school teacher and a woman from the 19th century Bengal. What inspired this dual storyline? What themes did you intend to explore over here? And because it was your first novel, did you actually ended where you intended to end when you started?
No, people say I'm a bit of a step parent in my first novel. A lot of people are. I mean, some people write these amazing first novels. I felt my first novel was a bit immature. You know, I was doing my PhD, I was writing my doctoral dissertation, and I was writing this novel at the same time. But I have some affection to the story, and that story, as you just pointed out. And you know, for me, novels come to me from life. I need a seed of a reality, a little seed. You know, with Firebird, it was that strange memory of that. With the scent of God, which I'll talk about in a minute, there are other things. Often it's an atmosphere. So what happened was, I think I was visiting. I was doing my PhD at the time, and I think it was my uncle's house. And he had a friend who was a struggling writer. He wrote in Bengali. And he told me that, you know, I found this manuscript. And it's written by this woman. And I want to sell it. Can I sell it to an American library and make some money? And that really kind of struck me, like he's trying to make money of this, but it's also a piece of handwritten memoir. I never saw that actually. But I started to imagine what that memoir might be. And I started writing that memoir. And you know, there's a lot of really interesting stories about these memoirs written by women in 19th century Bengal. There's these really interesting stories how women who are not actually given education, but they eavesdropped. Their brothers were being taught by their private tutors, and they just eavesdropped, and they actually made themselves literate. So I imagined a woman like that who is married into an aristocratic family at the age of 12, and then becomes a widow, a young widow, and then, and I imagined this school teacher in 1980s Calcutta who discovered this manuscript. And it's a single day in his life. He's going about trying to get his pension. And it's this communist government which is very corrupt. There's a lot of violence. He's failing. And in between his day, he's reading this manuscript. So I was like trying to bring these two stories together. And there's this really interesting histories in South, like what is called subaltern history. Like histories where voices which are forgotten, people who can't tell their stories, whether it's a peasant, a working class person, a lower caste person, how do they tell their histories? And I think in this novel was trying to bring together two voices which have been completely forgotten by history and sort of bring them together. So I like the idea, I like the story. I think the style, I hadn't quite found my voice. So I usually don't recommend, as you can see, I didn't bring that novel here.
Oh my God, that's like really Stepley behavior, huh? You did not bring the book either. So. Moving from your first novel to your most recent one, you know, and that's the one which I recently read, you know, The Remains of the Body, and that's the one some of us in the audience would have read, or at least all of us are going to take home with us today. I was deeply moved by its exploration of the complexities of human emotion and memory, you know. The characters of Abhi, Kaustubh and Sunetra are sort of, I mean, they intricately developed and each contributing to the novel's rich tapestry of personal and collective history. You know, the way you weave these stories together to sort of highlight the residual impacts of their past experience is particularly moving. Tell us a little bit about how this novel came about and what was the theme you were trying to explore in this. And I mean, it's a page turner. I actually finished back to back in a couple of hours, so like, you know, it was fantastic.
That's what every writer wants to hear.
Yeah.
I'm going to grill you more on that offline. So, yeah. No, I'm really glad you enjoyed it, and I hope some of you enjoyed it. It's also the shortest novel I've written. I don't know, it came out. But I think I have to say that, I know one doesn't realize, I think novels are really strange, wild things. They come to you while almost you're sleeping. But looking back, I realize one theme that has become a persistent theme with me is sexuality, and especially disruptive forms of sexuality which do not fit into kind of a normative mode in society. So going back to the Firebird again, the boy's fascination with his mother had something Oedipal about it. He's looking at his mother and there's a kind of an attraction which is, and then of course the whole sexual lives of actresses, the faintly disrespectable aura. So that was very much there. After that, I wrote this novel, The Scent of God, which I think was became the best known of my novels because of the theme, and is about two boys who fall in love, who are actually in the in a boarding school run by a monastic order. And I know for me atmosphere is very important. So I remember I went to a school like this. I did go to a school like this. Even though the story is fictional, I remember the atmosphere. It's a saffron monastic order, and it was full of celibate monks and all that. And yet in the middle of it, these are boys who are coming of age. They're attaining puberty. So this strange kind of atmosphere, connection between celibacy and sexuality stayed with me. So for instance, you're sitting in a prayer hall, you're singing a hymn, there are flowers, incense, and your knees are touching another boy. And that atmosphere was so powerful for me that I thought I wanted to write something about it. And it's really, people ask me later, oh, do you identify as queer or not? And like, that really doesn't matter. It's a phase one goes through and one writes, and I have really funny stories about that phase of my life too, because I was known as a people knew that I wrote well, so a lot of people used to come to me with requests like, will you write a love letter for me? I have this crush on this boy. So I written about this. I became this designated writer of love letters for people, and it's really funny I realized that it really is wonderful training for a novelist. That when you're writing a love letter for somebody, you're becoming another person. You're simulating feelings you don't have. And that is essentially what you do when you be a novelist. And there's a lot of funny stories about that. But that was the strand that came into Remains. With Middle Finger, I wrote another novel in between, which was my attempt to sort of write a contemporary campus novel version of the Ekalavya story. That I thought, oh, we face this all the time. We face students who are not from the kind of social class, who claim knowledge. How do you deal with it? And it's not just about Drona's problem, but can you really talk to them? And at the same time, it was informed by the whole Plato's idea of learning and erotics. There's a kind of erotic connection between the teacher and the student. So I wanted to write a novel where Drona and Ekalavya have feelings for each other. But they are both women in my novel, so so there's
Mona and Eklavya have feelings for you.
Yes,
Okay.
it's very subtle, but it's there. It's very much there. It's actually a really interesting story by Wendy Doniger.
You're making us want to read each and every one of this book. Great selling over here, like.
Oh, these are fascinating. These stories are already there in our midst.
I'm quite intrigued. Yeah.
It's really interesting. The Wendy Doniger, the historian, has this story that the Jain version of the Ekalavya story is that where, it's not Drona who asks for the Guru Dakshina, it's actually Arjuna, because he was jealous of Ekalavya. He said, you cut off your thumb and give it to Drona. And then Drona finds out about it and says that, oh, you crook, you actually cheated him. So it's my blessing that the Bhil will be able to shoot with his index and middle finger. So that is the title of the novel, The Middle Finger. The people obviously think it's something else. And I have no problem with that. But the title actually comes from that telling of Doniger's story, that how the Bhil shoots with his middle finger. And in my novel, it's not archery but poetry. So she wants to learn how to write poetry. And then that's the Drona Ekalavya story. But even then, that connection, and I was writing this also in the wake of the Me Too movement, of the Me Too, which actually swept across media, academia, and this whole question of erotics, not necessarily sexuality, but erotics. So all of that, I think, has been a running strand through my novels, and finally to the last one, The Remains of the Body, which is, I think, it's more like a novella. It's the shortest thing I've written, but I think it's really asking. It's about three characters only, two men who are childhood friends, and one of them is married to a woman. So it's about these three. And it's at one level, it's about the limits of male heterosexual friendship. I mean, we think of our friends, especially friends we know from childhood. We know their bodies so well. We've seen them. We might have shared underwear, but why is that relationship not erotic? What are the limits? And this is something that one protagonist is wondering. And that leads him to think about his wife is also in a certain way, because he's looking at his wife and thinking that she has known his body, which I haven't. And you've read the novel, so you know what ends up.
Absolutely. And it's, I mean, what I really loved about the novels is it sort of delves into experiences that can be deeply felt but very difficult to articulate. But you've articulated them so well, right? Like they're complex emotions, and which you've beautifully penned down. So, I mean, I'm sure everyone who's going to pick up a book will read through it and truly understand what the book is about. But tell us, if you had like one takeaway for our audience from that book, right? What would that be, right? Like,
That's always a hard one. I guess there's marriage for one thing, and I've been talking about this book. I started saying like marriage is like blue cheese. With time, it starts to stink. But the connoisseur, a real connoisseur, knows how to appreciate the stench. So
nice.
there's that. I think you can't, and that's complicated thing. So marriage is definitely a theme, and the conflicts of marriage in this particular novel, it comes through career ambitions, and the kind of career ambition women have, and I think some journalist asked me like, oh, how does love and power coexist? And I said, love and power always coexist. Love is always weaponized. People always say, I love you, let me do this for you. Indian parents do that all the time for their children. Look at what we did for you, and you're ungrateful, this kind of emotion.
You love us, do
Yeah,
this.
exactly.
Yeah?
And I think one thing I ended up doing in this novel is that I think often husbands do that. That, oh, I know what's good for you. I know, I know you. You can't take failure. You don't go into the career of science, go into the corporate world. So that is one big theme in this novel. Of course, sexual questioning is another big theme. Like, who are we attracted to? I mean, in some ways, the protagonist is someone who wonders why we are not attracted to multiple genders. What happens? Why is it that in spite of being really close to somebody, knowing their body, I don't feel that attraction? Why is it that I'm attracted to somebody else? And also I think it's also probably my most daring of my books. I think the questions it asks is, when we are being intimate with somebody, are we really thinking of them, or are we with somebody else? So these kind of questions are, there. And I think it's also, in some ways, one of my more erotically adventurous of my books. But definitely marriage, friendship, immigrant ambition. It's also strange. I've written all these books set in Indian cities, and I think Indian cities are such fascinating places. There's carnivals. There's so much noise, so much color, interruption. But this one I wrote set in American suburbs, and anybody who's spent any time in an American suburb knows like the silence of those places are deadening. Really, I mean, New York City is different, but absolute deadening silence. And I realized that the silence of the suburb allowed me to focus on interior lives more. I kind of looked inwards. If my novels like Firebird and Scent of God are like kind of epic cinematics films, this is more like a Netflix show. It's kind of inside, the dialogue, the conversation, the erotic tension between characters, and that allowed me to explore it. But I think, the real answer about what to take away should come from someone who's read it. So maybe you can answer that question.
No, absolutely. I actually love the theme of marriage, and I talk a lot about it, how, at least for women, because I'm very passionate about women's empowerment, right? So I tell women that marry right. That's one of the best decisions you can take in life. And in this particular novel, and I don't want to spoil the plot for anyone who's reading it, but the way sort of Avik sort of tries to command over his wife's future, right? Like by saying, oh my God, I know exactly what is right for you. And in his mind, he's probably coming from a really good space as well, right? He's not trying to harm her, but yet in some way has harmed her. So that was something which I thought was a great takeaway from the book, in addition to everything else you've spoken about. So we're not going to share more details, like, the books for you to read after this session. Second, I want to delve into, I know you told me about the book, The Amateur, which is yet to release in India, but it's released in the US, and that talks a little bit about it. And you have a collection of essays, which are called The Critic as an Amateur. And I thought that was a very, very interesting topic. Your essays and hopefully your book suggests that the amateur impulse, the untrained, enthusiastic, and engaged in unorthodox ways, can enrich the field of literary criticism, where you're trying to explore, who should a critic be, right? Like, and can amateurs be critiques? And we have a bunch of book enthusiasts, and we have our book club members out here as well, and we do try and critique a book every month, so that it's a very fascinating topic. Tell us a little bit how you think about this, an amateur as a critique.
Right. No, that's a great topic. I mean, it's. I think one always thinks like, is art, both creating art and thinking about art, does it require expertise, or can anybody do it? It's like, we always say in literature, it's a soft subject. What is a soft subject really? A soft subject is a qualitative subject, which is essentially using emotions, ideas we use in everyday life. A hard subject, economics, I think, is always shown. Economics has become much harder over the last few decades. It used to be softer. It used to ask these philosophical questions. Now it's become very mathematical.
Yes,
so it's moved away. So I think the question is, you always say that, we're doing film studies, or you're doing music, so you're doing literature. Oh, anybody can do that. We all talk about these things, and but thermodynamics or engineering, now and that also becomes very interestingly gendered, because obviously we know in India those subjects are also gendered. So and I started thinking like, that's a great thing. I'm proud of the fact that anybody can do what I'm doing. Or first of all, anybody wants to do what I'm doing. I don't know of that many parties where people chat about thermodynamics, maybe scientists do, I'm sure. But I think most parties, people do talk about films and books and music. Those things are there. So I always say that it's wonderful that we are a subject of great amateurs. But that being said, the history of the discipline also tried very hard to establish its professional credentials. That how can it be housed in a university? If anybody can do it, then how do you justify giving a degree in it? In fact, that's why Oxford and Cambridge for the longest time didn't have English. I'm like, English, everybody reads the poetry and fiction in their leisure time. It's not sufficiently painful enough to justify a degree. I mean, to get a degree, you must suffer, right? So they had classics. So classics is something you aspire to, but everybody reads their own. So I'm sure some of that is there around getting a degree in Hindi or any of the regional languages, like, anybody can do it. And that really, I really pursued the thought that if anybody can do it, then what makes somebody's criticism, somebody's thinking special? And it's not just criticism, even the act of writing. Often, because I also teach creative writing, people ask, can you really teach writing? Is it really possible? And that's a whole other conversation. I do think the art forms which are more technical are more teachable. So film studies is the most technical of all. I think music has its technicalities. I think literature is the least technical. Poetry is more technical than prose, because poetry has technicalities. So I think, the question that I think both arts and art criticism, there's a dialectic, there's a kind of tension between the professional and the amateur. And they're unresolved. It is both professional and amateur at the same time. You cannot say one dominates over the other, and that is the beauty of it. And that is what made me write this. So the one, Critical Amateur, is a collection of essays, not by me. There were people contributing from all over the world. I just edited it. But this book that is coming out is about amateurs of a certain kind. So I was very interested. There's a really interesting book about the intellectual life of the British working classes. So how the working classes read books, like on the mines, weaving. So people who are poor, people who don't have proper education, how they read. So in many ways, this amateur book is about people who, can you read books without a proper education? How do you pick up something and start reading? So I look at Africa, especially South Africa, how black intellectuals and writers and activists were actually reading in the time of apartheid. They didn't have a proper education. How in people in India who are under this very clerical model, which kind of they became bored, they started shirking. They started sitting in last benches and reading poetry, how they were not paying attention. So I look at these different locations. So it's a book of how I think sometimes we are tired of institutionalized education, and certainly the picture of this student across the British Empire, the backbencher who's not paying attention to the lecturer, but is reading a book of their own. They're scribbling. What is that student doing? And I think historically, some of the students are actually the most interesting. So a certain kind of creative amateur figure who deviated from education and yet became very idiosyncratic but charming reader is what has always fascinated me. But the larger question is always like, can you, when you're talking about art and literature, film, a public intellectual, is a public intellectual a professional or an amateur? Somebody says a public intellectual is a post-professional amateur. They're deep professionals who kind of look like they're amateurs, because unless you look like you're amateurs, you're not going to connect with your reading public. So you must posture, you must perform a certain kind of amateurism, which is actually deeply learned. So these are fascinating questions. So I try to explore some of that.
And we're quite intrigued and looking forward to this book in October. Saikat, much like how parents are often said to have no favorites amongst their children, they say all fingers are equal, or rather not equal. Writers might also feel that they should cherish all their books equally. However, I must admit, I'm my dad's favorite, so I'm pretty sure you have a favorite novel too.
Is your dad here? He would be embarrassed. You probably would protest to say that if you have siblings. So.
No, I have two siblings, but they're not protesting. But yeah, I'm curious. Do you have a favorite book amongst all the books you've spoken about?
I already said I'm a step parent to my first novel, so that's very out. It's a hard one. I think with each book you feel you become better on a technical level. It's like this interesting conversation in sociology you had between culture and civilization. That civilization always gets better. We build better bridges, invent better medicine, but art doesn't proceed like that. Not every playwright after Shakespeare is better than him. So art is very unpredictable. So I think in a writer's life there's something similar, that you always get better on a technical level. Your language, your style improves. But a book is not just language and style and technique. A book has a soul. And that soul is very hard to predict which one is better. I do think that Firebird is a very special book because of the personal connection. And it was also the book where I found my voice. Scent of God is also an important book because I think that was where I was really experimenting with sexual desire in a way, and I was going outside of my own subjectivity. Some of my closest readers have said that Remains is my best book so far because in terms of craft, in terms of intimacy, it is really, I don't know, but I have to say I do have a special place for the Firebird, and I also happen to read, so the filmmaker Anup Singh, who made Kissa and Song of Scorpions, has written a screenplay on this novel. He's putting a few things together, and maybe in a couple of years we'll see the book on the screen. I'm very interested to see how theatre will look on a film on the screen. And so that book definitely has a special place in my heart.
Amazing. So we do have a favorite child, and can we request you to read a few lines from this book, please? And I hope you've got
I'll just read maybe a very brief section because I know all of you have been sitting there very patiently, and I don't want to take up too much of your time. But I'll just read the opening. When I asked to read from novels, I always like to read the openings because it doesn't require a context. But I've already spoken a bit about this, so I think you might get what is going on. Disaster came early in Ori's life at the age of 5, the first time he saw his mother die. Around him was a warm nest of people who munched on popcorn, their faces lit up by the reddish-yellow light of the fire pit. They looked around, put their arms around him lovingly, their palms covering his eyes, and murmured, "Look away, you don't have to see this." To each other they said, "We should have put him to bed." They stroked him absently, unable to tear their eyes away from the slow dance of light and shadow on which his mother floated to her death. A few hundred black heads peeped out of the cotton sheets and woolen shawls around their bodies, gazing across the open ground, hypnotized by her pain. His father hugged him, but his arms felt cold. "You're crying," his voice mocked, sounding as if it was coming from far away. "Do, Boka." Ori didn't scream, But the world blurred as tears pooled at the corners of his glasses. Nausea gathered in his bowels like thick mist, and the heat rose to his skin. In the blurred light, he saw his mother's head slump back as she lay on the ground. She was dead. Her long hair spread on the floor like a still pool of blood. A breath of relief raged through him. He sensed his fever evaporate and his skin turn cold from sweat. He did not know when he had fallen asleep. His father had grabbed his wrist. "Come," and led him through the darkness, whispering, "Just hold on to my hand. Tight kore." They had inched their way under the makeshift wooden structure, through narrow passages veined with electric cables, to the room of white light and giant mirrors. It was the kind of room he would see hundreds of times, all over the country, choked with the smell of wigs and makeup and cotton and silk, charged with the sauciness of women in bras and petticoats smoking cigarettes, the hairstyle of Mughal princesses still heaped over their heads. That night, he had needed to see her, still heavy with gold jewelry and the rich sari, her hair a black river flowing down on her back. She caught sight of his reflection in the long mirror before her, smiled, and came back to life. But she did not turn around, or leave her seat to take him in her arms. He stood at the threshold for a long moment. Her smile felt strange, out of place. He had just seen her suffer a life of misery and meet her death with calm. And here she was, in the green room, thick with cigarette smoke and sharp with the glare of electric bulbs lining the mirror, smiling, alive. His heart leaped with happiness and a pang of betrayal. Blinded by the light in the mirrors, he averted his eyes.
Wow. Again, we're really, really looking forward to reading this, Saikat. Thank you for this short reading. Saikat, for those in the audience who are aspiring writers or literary enthusiasts, either aiming to pursue a career in literature, your journey and accomplishments provide immense inspiration. What advice would you give to these individuals who are starting out in their field, Are there any particular habits or practices or mindsets that you believe are crucial for nurturing a successful writing career?
I think it's rather arrogant of me to offer advice. I prefer the term suggestion. I think a writer can only say what worked for them. It's such a personal thing that I can only say, this is how I did it, and now it's up to you. One thing I have to say, that I was a reader long before I became a writer. And to anybody who wants to write, my advice, suggestion, whatever it is to read. Really read as widely as possible. I'm sure people have heard this from everybody, but I think this is more important today because I feel people are reading much less, and even writers are reading much less. And I think that's partly fine because we have other cultural forms that's competing. We have Instagram, we have digital Netflix, we have all of that, and writers must pay attention to these also, because you can't. Writing itself is part of technological change. The novel wouldn't come into being without a printing press. Before that, we didn't have the novel, so there's no point resisting technology. We must embrace technology. We must move ahead with it. But it would be a shame if we really kind of gave up the older forms. See, and that's why I think it's really important to read also, because you need to know where you belong as a writer. What's your tradition? So when I chose to write, I could write in Bangla, I could write in English. I chose to write in English because I felt there's a wider tradition that I can access. I'm part of a larger tradition. I'm more excited by this. And there were other reasons, and I'm not saying that's a right decision, but I think you need to know where you are. I think often when we read book reviews today, we feel like it's like kind of doing a restaurant review, but no books come from sort of blankness. They come from other books, they come from traditions, and that is really vanishing. So that is really important. In fact, even when I teach a creative writing class, I tell my students that, the biggest lesson of this class is not writing, it's reading. and not just reading published books, but reading works by your fellow writers. The draft is a living animal. It's not born yet. It's a work in progress. So when you can edit somebody's draft, give feedback, you're learning to be an editor yourself. One thing, we don't know if creative writing can teach one to be a writer. It can definitely teach you how to edit. It tells you. So writers have this magnet on their fridge often: write drunk, edit sober. And there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, when you write, you can't control anything. But you have to become a sort of a sane, rational person after that to shape it. And that is the part that is teachable. And for that, in a workshop, in a semester, you might just write a 5,000 word story at the most, but you might read 30,000 words of other people's writing. And that is the most valuable thing. So read a lot, read published books, read manuscripts, develop a community of people, with whom you can share manuscripts, whose work you read. And that is something that stays with you. Even now, when I first finish a draft, I have a few writer friends whose judgment I really trust. I would first show it to them. Even before it goes to an agent or an editor, I first share it with them. And that feedback is really important to me. So that is my advice, read, write, and share, yes.
Super fabulous. Thank you for those wonderful tips. Saikat, I have one final question before I sort of move on to a fun part of our discussion. As a professor of literature at Ashoka University, you're deeply involved in the study and teaching of liberal arts, right? And in today's rapidly evolving technological landscape, generative AI is increasingly becoming a part of various fields, including arts and literature. What do you see the role of generative AI in liberal arts today? Tools like ChatGPT, they shape our conversations. In fact, they help me write these questions. So if they're seeming clever, kudos to ChatGPT, right? One cannot ignore these technologies, right? So as someone who's teaching this to young minds, what is your view on them? Do they adapt it, and to what extent?
Well, this is the elephant in the room. I think everybody is anxious. I speak to a lot of high schools and colleges, and because I also write on higher education. I wrote this book, I think it's here, this book called College. It's about kind of giving a little bit of advice of kind of what education is going to be and things like that, and especially interdisciplinary liberal arts education. And the big anxiety is like, what's going to happen? Are there going to be any jobs 10 years from now on? If this is, and that's something I keep telling them, that you can't really prepare for a career because we don't know what careers are going to exist. So I think it's a big unknown. I've spoken to a lot of people, a lot of scientists also, and even they can't predict. But looking at the visible arc, it doesn't seem like AI will really sort of replace the truly imaginative and creative elements of the work. A lot of the grunt work, a lot of the memo writing, a lot of that will go. But the defining thing is AI is still a creation of human subjectivity. So, and this is one thing I'm trying to remember what is the name of this image generating tool. This created a lot of controversy. Mind something, I'm forgetting that name. It's AI generated image, Mindscape or something, Mind something, I'm forgetting the name. But it's really interesting that it came up with, so when it was asked to say, what does a scientist look like? A scientist is always white and male. A poor person is always black. An Indian person is always an old man with a beard. And there's this...
this is my favorite, an investor is always a man.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so
exactly. So we know, this is what is happening. And there was this, I think Amazon was using this AI-based recruitment method, and it was just weeding out women applicants because they were just... So the problem is AI, the algorithms who are writing AI reflects their biases, it reflects their strengths and their weaknesses. So AI is still not beyond subjectivity. Whether AI will have a subjectivity. I think we heard the story of this robot committing suicide.
Yes.
Was it that? So that, I think that is a really chilling story.
That shook.
That shook.
Right?
You can feel sadness. So that is the frontier. But so far I think I don't see that. It's like how that's quite going to happen as long as there's. I always tell my students that look at today, the biggest battles are about ideology. People are not even talking about things like global warming or jobs. They're talking about symbolism. They're talking about what is freedom, who's an outsider, who belongs. These very liberal questions are the ones that are actually bothering us. So humanities are central to this. So I think that is actually, and I think the educationists need to think a lot about it. I often tell my students, my exams or whatever assignments are open book, open internet. I can assure you will not find answers anywhere. You can do whatever you want, So it's like, again, I've written about this in this book, that our education system has been a very much a consumption-driven system. How well you consume knowledge, but we need to also make people produce knowledge. So often when I might give a midterm where there's a essay prompt, my final will not have any prompt. Design your own question and answer it. Essentially, you ask them to do what you ask a PhD student to do at a very micro level. So the point is, if you really give this kind of creative assignments, I don't think ChatGPT is really at a very poor form. If anybody uses ChatGPT to write an answer, I know that like 3 words I'll know. I don't know, this might change. In the next 10 years, they might become much smarter, much more sophisticated. But so far, it's very easy. So I think it's really still predictable. It's still at an early form. And I don't think any form of liberal arts education, and the most exciting form of liberal arts education in the 21st century is going to be the unusual promiscuous combination between the qualitative and the quantitative. So whenever at Stanford, the computer science department told us, design 2 dual majors for us, computer science and music, and computer science and literature. And this is from computer science at Stanford, which created Silicon Valley. So this is the kind of mixed method that will actually dominate liberal arts education. And I say that people who have this kind of skills, I don't think we still have anything to worry about from AI, but that's still one step at a time.
No, absolutely. And my personal view is, at the end of the day, whether it's generative AI, that seed of imagination has to be original, right? That's what you have to sort of plug in, and that has to come from the human mind. That is something which AI is not yet capable of doing. And at the end of the day, I think one needs to sort of adapt technology and use it in its best stride and still evolve as a human being. So,
the important thing to remember is that, human intelligence is not a given thing. It has changed historically. I think some of us in this room might remember a time when handwriting was a really important skill. I think children are still told that, but how often? And someone like me who always had awful handwriting, was like, I'm so happy to actually get out of that. Even spellings, some people say that use the spell checker or calculators. So it's very interesting, and the definition of human skill has changed, and AI has been with us actually for quite a while. The big question is, what will remain perennial, what will remain classical, and which will resist the test of time. And I still think a kind of innovative liberal arts education is that education. I do believe that, because that is something that will still last the test of time.
Super. I know there are some students of liberal arts in the audience, and they're heaving a sigh of relief. So Saikat, now let's come to some fun questions. We call this the rapid fire, right? And
I've had fun so far anyway. So
yeah,
it's not like it was difficult.
No, okay. So quick answers. Favorite author?
That's a tough one, because as someone who reads as much as I do, I don't think it's fair. There was a time I was very much into the influence of the writer James Joyce. I think I read Ulysses like 5 times. I don't think I'm as much of a fan of Joyce anymore. I'm a huge fan of Rabindranath Tagore. I think some of his songs, his stories, novels really speak to me at a very fundamental level. But I really can't name a favorite author. There's just
one word answers is what we are looking for. Like quick, one. Favorite book?
Oh God. This is actually turning out to be much more. This is not fun. This is difficult. It's easier to name favorite among my books than But favorite book, I don't know. Going by the authors I just named, I think I really like Joyce's Ulysses. Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. It told me a lot about becoming an artist. Rabindranath, I loved Sheshir Kavita. That is a work that never gets old. So, but again, there are hundreds of those. I could go on. This
Okay.
could take up.
What's on your bedside table right now?
Okay, what I'm reading right now. So I'm reading this really amazing biography of the Hindi writer Nirmal Verma by Vineet Gill. I think it's called Here and Thereafter. It's a really little short biography. And I haven't read much of Verma himself, but this book is wonderful. It's really, really interesting, and how a biography can be written almost like a novel. It opens with Verma's death, actually. And Verma was a chain smoker, and then it goes through his time in Prague. So I'm really enjoying this book. There are a couple of other books also, but if you want me to name one book, I'll name
Yeah.
that.
And do you read one book at a time or multiple books simultaneously?
Hundreds, no, not hundreds.
Yeah.
I read a lot of books at the same time. I think I
Yes.
liked what you said, that you read a fiction and non-fiction and things. I'm
Yeah.
also like that. I read different kind of things. I read news articles. I write op-eds a lot. So I'm very promiscuous. I cheat between my books
Yes.
all the time. So definitely.
Likewise, right? I cheat between my books too, right? Favorite place to write?
This is interesting. So I have this very weird habit of writing. I walk and write.
That's a new one.
Yeah. So what I do is I feel I'm very stimulated when I'm writing. I can't sit. In fact, I walk and read too. So when I think I'm throughout the day I'm just walking, basically. So what I do is I put my laptop up on this cupboard or some sort of a place, and I sort of just pace between sentences. Occasionally, I'll take my iPad and actually walk while typing. So I find it really, so when I'm thinking, I just can't sit. So when I lecture, I'm walking up and down, So I must have noticed I moved a lot during this talk too, because I just move. And it just feel like my thoughts are like, it's going to come out and flow out of my head, and my body must run after them. So I have this very weird habit of walking and writing. So there is no place. I walk all over the house.
That's a new one. Very, very interesting. Any writing rituals you follow?
I always say that, I don't like to spend time. It's like words. I have this little thing like, okay, I'm going to write 1,000 words a day or something like that. That has been useful. I have this weird habits, like sometimes I feel like this happens most when I'm writing newspaper op-eds. I have a couple of columns and I'm like, oh, this is a really complex idea. I must get this out. But when I'm getting this out, I can't pay attention to language. I can't do both. So I hit all caps on the keyboard. And I tell myself, I'm not going to care about the language. I'm just going to get it out in a raw form. And that really frees me. And funnily, the language is actually fine because I've freed myself of the worry of writing. And then sometimes what I do is, like, when I finish writing for the day, this is something I picked up the tip from a writer. There's a park on the downward slope. So I start a little bit of what I would the next section. So, and then I stop. So when I pick it up the next day, I mean, it's already on a kind of gear. So it's very easy to start. Rather than finishing a section and ending that day and then starting all over again, I start a little bit, maybe one sentence, and let it be. So these little habits have really helped me.
That's a great tip, right? To park on a downward slope. That's fantastic. First book you ever read that left a mark on you?
Oh God, I've been reading so long that it's very hard. I mean, I think a lot of us fairy tales, I mean, I remember I had this red bound cover of Ukrainian folk tales. I think some of us might remember all these. I think there's a wonderful folk tale, fairy tale in Bengal called Thakuma Chuli. So those stories are obviously really powerful. Also forms of Ramayana, Mahabharata. There's so many of these books. I don't even know, I mean, when I started reading.
If you could have dinner with any literary figure, who would it be?
Probably a food writer. I think writing about food is so interesting. I love to write about food. So all my books, if you read them or if you read some, know that there's something about food going on. There's some kind of a food, not necessarily delicious food. Sometimes delicious food, but like
there's a fair bit of cooking and like stuff in this book as well.
There
right?
is
They're whipping up of
food
dinner and
and
dinners.
yeah, and I'm also a wine person, so there's also a little bit of wine. I already spoke about stinking cheese, so you can see that food always plays a role. Or for that matter, in boarding school, starving young boys, what they can do to eat. So there's always food. So I don't know. I mean, I was reading this book by the French philosopher Roland Barthes, where he writes about sushi in this incredible way. And he writes about sushi in a very sensory way. So I wonder what it would be to have a sushi dinner with Roland Barthes. What would he say?
Amazing, interesting. Kindle or traditional books?
Oh, both, definitely. I mean, the volume of books I read, there's no way I can stick to one format. I mean, promiscuous reader will
Yes.
take things wherever they can. So
Super,
I read a lot on my iPad, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. I also have, like, I read on the Kindle. I have one book and one bedside. Yes, absolutely. Do you prefer writing in silence or with background noise?
That's a really interesting question. Obviously, I would say silence initially, and then I had kids. And then I know, I mean, again, with all respect for all the mothers in the room, I know fathers don't deal with anything commented about mothers deal, but we had my share. So I did write with my daughter, like at the time 2-year-old, and sort of making noises and writing. I think the idea of silence goes after that. Now they're older, so my son is 10 and my daughter is 14, so they're now happy with that. But I think, I'm used to writing in noise, but what I think bothers me is if there's language. So if I'm sitting and there's some noise happening, I can write, but when my daughter starts playing Taylor Swift, then because that's also language, and language interface with language. So I'm fine. I might just start playing some jazz instrumentals and put on my headphones and write, because there's no language in it. But the moment there's language, I'm like, no, Taylor Swift's language is messing with my language. So I'm like, so it's kind of mixed, yeah.
I actually wrote my PhD dissertation with my daughter being 3 years old. So, like, it was.
Oh my God, yeah, you have my profound admiration. That's just incredible.
So, do you type or manually write?
I type. You don't want to see my handwriting. If I write something on some of your books, you'll probably ask me, what have you written? I keep getting this thing like, what is that? I couldn't understand what you've written. So my handwriting is terrible. I do type.
Type. Yeah. And last, do you have a favorite quote or line from literature?
I am generally not a quote person, because I think quotes are okay, they're like made easy kind of a thing. But there's one quote by the French writer Alain Robert-Grillet which I really stayed with me. I don't actually believe in it, but I think it's very provocative. And this quote is, the true writer has nothing to say. What matters is the way he says it. He uses he, that is choice of pronoun, but what matters is the way he says it. So I thought that's really interesting. Like, it's very provocative that you have nothing to say, but the manner is what matters, and that has stayed with me.
Very interesting. Saikat, I know we've sort of shot over our time, but if we can take one or two questions from the
absolutely.
audience.
Yeah.
Yes? Okay. We'll just give around the mic.
Hi, Saikat. Thank you very much for this peep into the writer's mind. I mean, for a lot of these young people, this was a window to the process. But I just want to ask, the two words which you used, one was rational and other was subjectivity. Now, human beings are very fond of thinking that they are very rational. But neither neuroscience nor psychology and nor a deep peep into philosophy will tell you that all our rational thoughts are too much entwined in emotions. And a lot of fictional writing is about emotion, eventually. Right? So if you keep writing, and now I'm just comparing it with another art form called cinema. A lot of films, when you see them, it's going very tight till the first half, and second half will bomb, especially Bollywood. And then you don't know. Then I ask the directors whether you have seen your own film. So do you writers, I'm actually non-fiction type of writer, do you fictional writers at any point of time during the process of creation really look at your work objectively? Is it possible, or you are able to just get into this?
That's a very interesting question. So one advice writers end up giving is to the editing process, after you've written a manuscript, put it away for a bit, put it away for a few months. Let it become alien to you. It's like you gave birth to a baby and then you wanted to disown it for a bit, because you cannot read your text as a writer. You must become a reader to it again. And that distance is supposed to help you make it alien enough. So I have this, again, talking of writing rituals. I will, if I finish something, I'll read it on a laptop in Word, then I'm turn it into a PDF document. It looks a little different. Then I'll print it. So everything is to attempt to make it look different. You know, maybe to use your language to bring the rational person, because it came out of me, I cannot be rational about it. So I have to create the distance. And time is a great creator of distance. So when I read it something after 3 months, then again it's fresh to me. So I think in many ways, I do believe the original writing impulse is very strange and mystical. No one knows where it comes from. I know sometimes when I'm trying to create a character and the character is turning out to be completely different, then I think it's working, because they are refusing to listen to me. They're running away. They have a life of their own. That's when it's working. So the irrational is very powerful. But yes, after I've written it, so any art form has a rational and an irrational aspect. The irrational aspect is often when they erupt. But to create you need finish. To make it ready for the world, you need to have a lot of technique. You need to kind of, that's when you suddenly get out of your hangover, get a lot of coffee and become sober. And then you edit it with reason. But I think the process is different with every writer. You know, it's very different. When I write op-eds, often I write with a personal voice, because the first person works really well. You know, it's kind of really interesting. There's this lovely story in the Aesop's fables. The Greek orator Demodus is trying to address this group, and oratory was very important in classical Greece, and nobody's paying any attention. They're talking, they're very attentive, and then he says, "Let me tell you a story." Immediately everybody's silent, pin drop silence. And then he says that, you know, what is the story? The goddess Demeter, a fish and a bird are taking a walk, and then they come to a water body, a river, and the fish swims into the water and the bird flies, and then he stops. And the audience is breathless. And what about the goddess? She's very angry at you for preferring stories to politics. I mean, the point is, people, this is what art offers as opposed to the social sciences. Social sciences study groups, but art offers the particular, the individual, a particular story. I mean, it's like I often say that, oh, if somebody comes and says, oh, this is a lot of data on students are cheating, number of students who are, you know, kind of trying to game the system, people would be interested. But then people say, do you know who cheats in your class? So the gossip is always about the personal. It's about a particular person, and that is, literature is often a really sophisticated, artful form of gossip, and that particular is what I think really stands out. So I think that play between the rational and the emotional obviously is, you need both, just the way you are both professional and amateur in art.
Thank you. Literature is an artful form of gossip. Let's end on that note, Saikat. And we'll take more questions, I think, offline. And we have you here with us for the evening. So thank you so much, Saikat, for sharing those insights.
Thank you for your questions. They were very, very probing.
No, I hope I didn't trouble you too much.
No, trouble is good.
Yeah.
The more you get trouble, the better things come out. So troubling is a good thing.
Super. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I would now like to call our Ehsaas woman, Geeta Malhotra, to give the vote of thanks.
It's been a very wonderful evening, and I think all of us are taking lots of it back home with us. I'm already done with one of the books, and I think I'm ready to plunge into the second one now. So as our enchanting evening draws to a close, I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to our distinguished author, Saikat Majumdar. We appreciate you sharing your time, insights, and stories with us. Your presence has been inspiring and enjoyable for everyone. Aarti, thank you for navigating the talk so well. It was very, very interesting, and especially the rapid fire was really good. Yeah, to our wonderful audience, your enthusiasm, your love for literature, and your support for Prabha Khaitan Foundation's initiatives are what keep the spirit of such gatherings alive. I extend my gratitude to our venue and hospitality partner, the Landmark Towers, our Hindi print media partner, Dainik Jagran, and the Ehsaas Women of Kanpur for their extensive support. Special thanks to our esteemed patron, Sri Cement Limited. The Prabha Khaitan Foundation fosters cross-state cultural understanding and appreciation. We support artisans and their exquisite craftsmanship to express our gratitude to our patrons and guests by endorsing their products. We encourage everyone to buy from these skilled craftsmen to promote the sustainability and development of handicrafts. At all our events, we serve regional cuisine, encouraging our authors to embark on a culinary journey to experience India's diverse food culture. And in doing so, we raise awareness about locally sourced ingredients in the city and community. In this context, we are pleased to present our guest author with an Azrak stole as a token of our appreciation. Azrak is inspired by the Mughal era and its distinctive Muslim architectural elements. A strong sense of repeated geometric patterns defines this art form. Practiced by artisans of Azrakpur and the Kutch region, this unique form of block printing typically uses natural minerals and vegetable dyes for creating Azrak pieces. Now, I would like to welcome Dr. Alok Bajpai, our pride of Kanpur, on stage to felicitate Saikat Majumdar.